This video was originally recorded February 2019 during the ongoing Force for Good class series. To learn more about this ongoing series, please visit tibethouse.us.
A lot of text I'm quoting from, there's a lot of sources I'm drawing on, but in the beginning in particular I'm drawing on two scholarly works by Sukumar Dutt and by Lalmani Joshi about the information here, but there's also a lot of data we've gathered ourselves about Nalanda and the texts translated from Nalanda, the Sanskrit text translated into Tibetan, and then we'll also be talking a fair amount about our translation project. So I'm going to be going over a lot of information tonight. Just go with the flow. You're not going to be tested on it. If you don't remember everything I cover, that's of course fine. Really just to give you a general impression of this amazing University of Nalanda and its tradition and the other universities in northern India and the Tibetan traditions that picked it up is what we'll be covering tonight. Okay, so again, sort of quick table of contents. We're going to be looking at Nalanda and the classical Indian Buddhist university system, the Indian Buddhistic Enlightenment or Renaissance culture that it spawned, the Tibetan Tengyur, those are the translated texts, both the structure and contents of those texts, the Tibetan canon compared with the Chinese canon briefly just to show why the Tibetan canon is so important, because so many of the Sanskrit originals were translated into Tibetan and only into Tibetan and not into any other language, including Chinese. So a brief few graphs there to demonstrate that. Then I'll be talking about some translation guidance and advice we received from His Holiness the Dalai Lama at some conferences that we sponsored and attended, in which we discussed with him precisely the question of which Tibetan Buddhist texts should be translated, what the priority should be. Tengyur translation logistics. Then of the many hundreds of texts and authors, thousands of texts by hundreds of authors, there are 17 in particular authors that the Dalai Lama recommended we begin with, so I'll be discussing that. And then briefly some ramifications for translating the Tengyur today, what kinds of impact it could have on global civilization. So we begin then in the Gupta period with Nalanda University. Nalanda, these are some pictures I took when I was there. It still exists in ruins, 1 story or less tall, in some cases taller. Wonderful place to visit. But the initial monastery of Nalanda was actually founded by King Shakyamuni in roughly somewhere between 415 and 455 of the Common Era. By 535, multiple interconnected monasteries were integrated, thus forming the first Buddhist Mahavihara. And this was then supported by the revenue of 200 villages in the area. It specialized, this consortium specialized in advanced postgraduate studies. They had open admissions with a stringent entrance exam. About 20 to 30% passed and got into the university system. About 100 lecterns distributed among different schools. 8 halls, 300 apartments, according to the Chinese historian Yi Tsing. About 10,000 students and staff, according to the Chinese historian Hui Li. So this was in the Gupta period. Now, a broader Nalanda tradition then emerged on the basis of this in the Pala period. An actual Indian Buddhist university system grew out of this. So as Sukumar Dutt explains, and here comes the small type, Nalanda lived on into this Pala regime. It came into the possession of the Palas as a cultural legacy from the great and spacious age of the Guptas, and the legacy was prized and cherished. Are you able to see that? You can read that text, right? Good. Some of the Pala kings, being Buddhists themselves, established Mahaviharas at different centers on the model of Nalanda. An interesting feature of these many university establishments under the Palas is the existence of a system of coordination among them. So right now, these are quotes from this book, Buddhist Monasteries in India by Sukumar Dutt. Evidently, all of them were under the state supervision. Each seemed to have recognized as a separate cooperation with standardized official seal of its own. And it seems from the evidence of the different seats of Buddhist learning that function in eastern India under the Palas were regarded together as forming a network, an interlinked group of institutions. So as far as the Pala period Indian Buddhist university system is concerned, we have at least at a minimum these, Nalanda University, which you can see, again, as we mentioned, it started in the late 400s. And then the Pala period begins in the early 700s, and so you can see the next four being founded then: Odantapura, Vikramashila, Somapura a little bit later, and then Jagadgala much later than that. And you see that they're all interrelated. Up in northern India, you'll see in a minute where this was. And you can see that they all come to an end rather precipitously around the same time. We'll be discussing that momentarily. So this is the area of India we're talking about. And you can see that highlighted region up in the northeast. This is the area. And if we zoom in on that, you can see the various names of the universities we just mentioned being highlighted: Nalanda, Odantapura, Jagadgala, Vikramashila. So that's the area we're talking about. So now if we look at Odantapura University, when Gopala, the founder of the Pala dynasty, built the new city of Odantapura in Magadha, that's India, the thought was perhaps in his mind that it should grow to be a center of Buddhist learning like Nalanda of the Gupta period. So he founded a Mahavihara here within walking distance of Nalanda, about 6 miles away. A couple bullet points. It was founded by the first Pala king, Gopala. Originally it had about 12,000 monks. Many famous scholars associated with Odantapura would have included Dipankara Sridhyana, or Atisha, who would be familiar to many of you if you've studied Tibetan Buddhism. Because although he was an Indian pundit, he was extremely important in the transmission of Buddhism to Tibet later on. He studied here for 2 years before going on to head Vikramashila. Odantapura in particular had an important connection with Tibet. The first Tibetan Buddhist monastery at Samye in Tibet was in fact built on its model in 749. So Buddhism is actually beginning to go into Tibet starting around 650. Within the next 100 years, it's really beginning to take root. And so the first monastery in Tibet, which looks like this, which is Samye Monastery, was built on the model of Odantapura. So then Vikramashila University, very important university. The old prestige of Nalanda seems to have devolved, this is Sukumar Dutt again, seems to have devolved on Vikramashila in the Pala age. In Tibetan legends, it holds about the same position of preeminence as is accorded in Chinese records to Nalanda. So some bullet points. It was founded by the second Pala king, Dharmapala, a Mahavihara on the Ganges with surrounding wall with 6 gates, each gate kept by an eminent pandita as gatekeeper. They had this amazing tradition in these universities where you'd have these gatekeepers. We'll be talking quite a bit about what was going on at these universities, what the curriculum was and so forth, but just briefly, they had gatekeepers at these universities, and the idea was if you came from outside and you wanted to get into the university, you didn't want to go through the usual route of applying with a 20% acceptance rate, you could actually debate the gatekeeper. And the gatekeepers were extremely well educated, obviously, in the educational system of the university. But if you could beat the gatekeeper in debate, you actually got to come in through the gate, sort of that was your entry pass, and you could debate your way into up in the university, all the way up to, if you succeeded, all the way up to the president of the university. And this would be a big public debate, moderated by many referees. And if it was held that you actually won the debate against the president, then it was understood that your ideas, your intellectual thinking, your tradition was actually better than that of the university you had just now defeated. And so you got to be the new president of the university. I'm not sure how often that happened, but at least in principle, this was the idea. It would be great if we could do this at Columbia. So each gate was kept by an eminent pandita. Pandita is like a high scholar, like equivalent of a PhD. There were 108 halls and 6 colleges at Vikramashila. 108 panditas were maintained by the state, salaries paid. Now this is important and interesting. 53 of the halls were for esoteric study and practice and 54 for general use. So esoteric study is, of course, Tantric Buddhism. Tantric Buddhism is really just getting up and running around this time. It had been certainly in place, Buddhist belief taught by the Buddha, but sort of kept underground and kept super secret, certainly through the beginning centuries of the Common Era, and somewhere in the 500s, 600s, it starts to become more publicly known. So fairly early on then in this university system, in the early 700s, you have this prominent university, Vikramashila, which is actually teaching Tantric theory and practice, and books are being written and debated. So you have people practicing it and studying it as well, in large numbers. As you can see, it was about half and half. So this is critical that this is going on at Vikramashila, and it will be critical to what happens as Buddhism goes into Tibet. So Abhayakaragupta is an extremely well-known, famous scholar. When Abhayakaragupta was head Adyaksha in the early 1100s, head of Vikramashila. There were then 160 panditas and about 1,000 resident monks. And obviously this particular university specialized in Tantric Buddhism, as we mentioned. There was an important Vikramashila Tibet connection, more so than even with any of the others. Vikramashila had considerable cultural intercourse with Tibet. Many scholars of Vikramashila since its foundation visited Tibet, so you had Indian scholars going up into Tibet. It seems also, in its turn, to have attracted scholars from Tibet, so Tibetans coming down to India to study at Vikramashila, according to Sukumar Dutt. There was actually a dedicated Tibet house. They called it just like Tibet house. A dedicated Tibet house at Vikramashila. According to Dromden's Life of Atisha, there was a dedicated lodging house outside the portals, which was assigned to Tibetans, Tibetan scholars. A large number of Tibetan scholars lived and studied in this college. Vikramashila University gave facilities for the translation of Sanskrit Buddhist works into Tibetan. So this was unique. Other countries didn't have this kind of association. We'll see in a minute why that was. Right here, Tibetan preeminence in the Pala period. So the Tibetans had a certain preeminent status in this period. As Sukumar Dutt explains, Nalanda of the Pala period is scarcely represented in Chinese records. And the Chinese historians were very instrumental. There were many of them coming to Nalanda prior to this time in the Gupta period, and much of what we know about Nalanda in that Gupta period comes from the Chinese historians, Chinese who came and studied there, became monks, brought Buddhism back to China and so forth. So we have an enormous amount of historical data from Chinese scholars in the Gupta period. But suddenly, Nalanda, which is still existing now in the Pala period, post-700, is scarcely represented in the Chinese records, which assembled so fascinating a picture of it in its earlier Gupta epic. In fact, there are few instances after the turn of the 8th century of Chinese monks coming into India for study and learning. Although from Nalanda and other centers, Indian monks did not cease to migrate to China, so Indians were still going to China occasionally. Sino-Indian intercourse was definitely petering out on the Chinese side, coming this way, by the middle of the 8th century. So Tibet now took place of China in cultural intercourse with India. This is again according to Dutt. Proofs of this intercourse appear in the history of the Pala establishments at Vikramashila. Tibetan lamas seem to have been held in great esteem. At least one Tibetan scholar is known to have been appointed a Dvaravapala, one of the gatekeepers at Vikramashila. Indian monks of these Pala establishments seem thus, through contacts with the lamas, to have become conversant with the Tibetan language. So you had Tibetans becoming obviously fluent in Sanskrit and spoken dialects of Indian languages, and Indians actually becoming very fluent in Tibetan. So this is a unique relationship that India and Tibet has. And these dates are important because, as I pointed out, Tantric Buddhism is really beginning to take off, and as we're going to see later on in the slideshow, it's really exploding from about 700 to 1200 in India. This is when all the practice and scholarship is taking place. And what's significant, as we just read, is that China has pretty much gotten the Buddhism it wanted or needed. They've formed their own traditions. They've got their own sutras. Many schools in China form around specific sutras. And what this means is that because they essentially stop importing Buddhist material from India, they really missed, and this is then true of most of East Asia, they really missed almost all of the Tantric Buddhist movement. So for the study of Tantric Buddhism, you really need to look at the Tibetan translations of Indian texts because they weren't translated into Chinese or Japanese. We'll be covering some more of that in a bit too. So as far as the nature of these universities, what exactly were they? Sometimes people think, well, these were just Buddhist monasteries. Actually, this is not the case at all. They were really liberal arts universities. So another scholar, Lalmani Joshi, explains the universal characters of these institutions. He says, Buddhist monastic colleges were the first systematic educational institutions in ancient India. It's quite proper to attribute the influence of Buddhism to the influence of Buddhism, the rise of organized public educational institutions in ancient India. They had truly a universal character. They were free from religious, political, or national barriers. They threw open their doors for all persons irrespective of caste, color, creed, or country. They disseminated not only Buddhist teaching, but also non-Brahminical studies and secular branches of learning. Nalanda University seems to have made provisions for specialized studies in almost all the branches of learning then known in India. So now Sukumar Dutt elaborates on this principle that Lalmani Joshi speaks of. From the 5th century on, a number of monasteries developed into centers of academic learning and scholarship. The learning was not confined to monks, but was made available to all seekers after knowledge, Buddhist and non-Buddhist alike. Thus, the studium generale character of a number of monasteries developed. There were, besides the monks, many lay students interested in studying either Buddhist literature or purely secular subjects. In these Mahaviharas, a reorientation took place of the old traditional monk culture, and this liberalized culture was the Indian, quote, Buddhist culture of that age. The Mahaviharas were both the depositories and purveyors of this Buddhist culture. This culture then also spread to the country from the Mahaviharas. So Lalmani Joshi continues to describe this liberal curriculum. So the curriculum was neither exclusively Buddhistic nor exclusively monastic. Non-Buddhist studies and secular arts and literature seem to have received their due share in the educational curriculum of these universities. Secularized learning, including the study of such subjects as Sanskrit language and its grammar, knowledge of Chinese and Tibetan in order to translate texts, knowledge of magic, medicine, arts and crafts, ability to teach polity, statesmanship, non-Buddhist studies such as the Vedas, useful sciences such as astrology, astronomy, alchemy, and the ability to compose verse and good prose, especially memorial verses. So again, this is much more like what we would think of as a modern university. They weren't just Buddhist, they weren't just monastic, they were studying all the arts and sciences of the time. So these really were, and nothing else existed like this prior to these, so these really were the world's, actually, the first universities in the world. In particular then, so we covered a wide range of the arts and sciences that they would have taught there, basically everything known at the time, but in particular they developed a system of 5 sciences or vidyas, which were a common division of knowledge at the time. This would have included number 1, Adhyatma Vidya, which is inner science or spiritual science, metaphysics and psychology. Number 2, Hetu Vidya or Tarka Shastra, which includes logic, epistemology, and the arts and rules of debate. Number 3, Shabda Vidya, or Vyakarana, including the linguistic, grammatical, and literary studies of Sanskrit language. Chikitsa Vidya, medicine and pathology, and number 5, Shilpastana Vidya, arts and crafts. So this was a common division of arts and sciences at the time. The 5 major ones, there was also 5 minor ones, and then other ancillary ones in addition to that. So that was the curriculum. And in terms of the libraries that they developed, these were really astounding. The Tibetan and Chinese accounts depict Nalanda's great libraries. They were huge multi-storied buildings. The largest was 9 stories tall, which was immense for that time, of course. And in fact, they were located in a part of the campus known as Dharma Ganja, or the Dharma Treasury. And in fact, there were 3 main libraries constituting this Dharma Treasury. And these 3 libraries were Ratnodari, Sea of Jewels, Ratnasagara, Ocean of Jewels, and Ratnaranjaka, Jewel Adorned. It's also reported that monks kept private libraries in addition to that, which they donated to the central library while they passed away. Joshi explains the international significance of the Nalanda libraries. Nalanda University Library was the only standard place where foreign scholars and translators could get authoritative texts. So it was something like a Library of Alexandria, if you're familiar with that, for Latin and Greek texts. And actually a comparison to the Library of Alexandria will be coming up shortly. So Sukumar Dutt suggests the massive extent of these libraries. King Devapala donated the revenue of 5 villages just for the maintenance of monks and the copying of manuscripts. You'll remember earlier we have about 200 villages supporting this monastic university in general. So the tax revenues of 5 villages in particular was dedicated just to maintaining the libraries. We can only surmise that Nalanda came into possession in the course of its centuries-old history of a huge wealth of manuscript literature, both original works written at Nalanda and copies of sutras and shastras. We'll be discussing this division in a few minutes as well, but this is an important division. So sutras are, of course, works attributed directly to the Buddha, and so basically a canon, a canonical collection of works attributed to the Buddha, both from the Pali canon and the Sanskrit canon. These would be sutras and Vinaya texts in particular, and to some extent Abhidharma texts. That would represent a number of, several hundred texts. And then, of course, there were the Indian scholars themselves writing in Sanskrit, writing commentaries on those. And then there would also be, they would also write their own original works. So sometimes there'd be commentaries on specific texts, and sometimes there'd be just their own treatise on epistemology or logic or some other topic. And those would be called shastras. There ended up being thousands and in fact millions of those texts written by scholars that would be familiar names to you if you've studied Buddhism, like Nagarjuna, Chandrakirti, Aryadeva, and so forth. So the extent of this manuscript wealth must have been appalling in its massiveness. I love this. This is his phrase. Simply appalling in its massiveness. So now in terms of the extraordinary volume of Sanskrit literature in general, we have some idea that these libraries were immense. Now let's try to pin that down a little bit more. We can say that extant literature, that's Sanskrit literature available to us today in the 21st century, is immense in volume compared with the extant literature of its classical sister language, Latin and Greek. Latin, Greek, and Sanskrit are sister languages. They're all Indo-European languages. They're all very related. If you study one, pretty easy to study either of the others. So Sanskrit extant literature is much larger than Latin and Greek. Richard Gombrich, citing data from Sanskritist David Pingree, explains, surviving Sanskrit literature is many times as large as Latin and Greek literature together. There may be as many as 2 million manuscripts extant today, although they are perishing fast. For comparison, there are perhaps 30,000 Greek codices, so 2 million versus 30,000. That's what's available today, and these are handwritten manuscripts. They didn't have printing presses or block prints at the time. So, wanting confirmation and further clarification regarding these numbers, I contacted Professor Pingree myself about this back in 2005. So I read this. Gombrich, a contemporary scholar, cites Pingree. Pingree's still around at Brown University, so I sent him an email saying, can you clarify this, confirm this, give me some further insight into these numbers. And Professor Pingree's handwritten response to me was as startling as it was enlightening. So I wrote them this nice email. He actually sends me back this handwritten letter in very, very small handwriting. Here's what his letter looked like, 2005. And here's a pull quote that I'm taking out of it. From his entire letter, he says, the number of Sanskrit or Indic, including Prakrits and vernaculars texts, was roughly estimated to be 30 million by Kapila Vatsyayana. So we have 2 million extant today. These are still existing from over 1,000 years old. But at the time, it's estimated there were 30 million Sanskrit texts. Now, these wouldn't have all been at Nalanda. This would have been at Nalanda, Vikramashila, and these other universities, and some in private collections. But the estimate is, in total, there was something on the order of 30 million Sanskrit manuscripts. But Pingree goes on to say, no one does or ever will know for sure the exact number. Many were in private collections, and only a minuscule percentage of those were in libraries, like those at Nalanda, which have been counted, and even fewer cataloged. So that's their best estimate, something on the order of 30 million. Whatever the exact number is, it's appalling in its massiveness, right? Okay, so what does this have to do with the Tibetan canon? I mentioned a minute ago then, there was, during this period, certainly from the beginning of the Pala period, from the 700s all the way up through the 1200s, there's all this intercourse going on between Tibetan scholars and Indian scholars, going back and forth. I also mentioned a minute ago that as far as specifically Buddhist texts are concerned, works attributed to the Buddha are one collection. That gets translated, every known text that was spoken by the Buddha gets translated into Tibetan, sometimes several times, edited and retranslated. That becomes a part of the Tibetan canon called the Kangyur, which means the translations of the Buddha's words, basically. And then of the millions of texts that were either commentaries on those or just, again, independent treatises on logic or art or public policy, of the millions, however many millions there were, over this several century period, about 4,000 texts were translated from Sanskrit into Tibetan, and this becomes what's called the Tangyur, or the Shastras, translations of commentaries and independent works. So you have several thousand, a couple thousand in the Kangyur and about 4,000 in the Tangyur. Tangyur is about twice the size. So this is the Tibetan canon, the Tibetan Buddhist canon brought from India. This core of 6,000 texts then becomes, of course, what triggers really an incredible Renaissance culture in Tibet over the next quite a few centuries, as Tibetans themselves study these in the Nalanda tradition. They'd imported the entire curriculum and the pedagogy, the educational system from Nalanda and Vikramashila. So the educational system was brought over, the 6,000 or so core texts were brought over, and then of course as the centuries progressed, Tibetans themselves would start writing their own commentaries on these texts and their own independent works, and these then over the course of centuries become hundreds of thousands of texts. So we have three layers to keep track of, right? We have the Buddhist sutras, things attributed to the Buddha, originally in Sanskrit, translated into Tibetan. You have the Indian commentaries on those and also Indian independent works, Shastras, translated into Tibetan, that becomes the Tengir in Tibetan, and then you have a third layer of literature in Tibet, which is indigenous Tibetan commentaries or indigenous Tibetan works, 3 different layers. What I'll be focusing on tonight is really the Tengir, and you'll see why in a few minutes, but I'll have a few words to say about both the Kongyur and the Tengir, and maybe not as much to say about the Tibetan commentaries. That would be 3 separate talks, really. So I'll be focusing on this middle level, the Tengir, for reasons that will become apparent. So the Tibetan Tengir then. The magnificent Indian universities were tragically destroyed by foreign invaders in the late 12th and early 13th centuries. I'm not going to elaborate on that other than to say Turkic invaders came and in the course of a generation literally destroyed the institutional infrastructure for Buddhism. So all of these universities were literally completely destroyed. You saw the pictures of the ruins in Nalanda. There's still some ruins there. Vikramashila was so utterly destroyed, it is said that the invaders came in, they knocked down everything. They of course burned all the books. They killed all the monks and lay people and nuns, whoever was living there. It is believed, some textual records seem to indicate that the invaders actually thought, it's hard for me to believe that they maintained this misperception for too long, but maybe initially, they thought these were actually military compounds because they were looked at these huge fortresses, and inside you had a lot of people with shaven heads, looks kind of like military guys. And so maybe they did, maybe they didn't, but that's part of the reason why they at least they say they killed. Of course, they weren't armed in any way, nor did they, to my knowledge, defend. So they basically killed quite a, whoever was there over the course of about a century. So there was time when people could smuggle out some books and escape with their lives, but many were killed, many libraries were burned. The monasteries were destroyed, that's why they're down to rubble. And Vikramashila in particular was so destroyed, it is said, they actually took every single brick of every single building and threw it into the Ganges River. So that we don't even know now, historians can't even figure out where Vikramashila was. There's no ruins whatsoever. And there's not enough accurate there's different historical hints that it might have been over there, it might have been over here, but there's no definitive proof as to where it even was. That's how utterly devastated it was. So, huge tragedy for India and for Buddhism and really for this enlightened Buddhistic culture that Lomani Joshi and Dutt speak of. Huge tragedy for India, although, in a way the good news is that because it had infiltrated this kind of knowledge, really, this sort of Renaissance culture over many centuries had really spread and infiltrated throughout India. So it actually affected both secular traditions as well as religious traditions, including Hinduism and Jainism and so forth. So much so that much of Hindu religion and culture post this period owes an enormous amount. When you sort of study how they change, both philosophically in terms of doctrine and practice, you can see very clearly very strong Buddhistic influence. So in a certain way you could say Buddhism in some ways sort of lives on in India through the incarnation of Hinduism and Jainism and various secular arts and sciences. But at least official Buddhism was destroyed at that time. So the one good news is it sort of lives on in India in that indirect way, and also it had several centuries to be transported into Tibet, where it sort of continued to live on in Tibet then. So as I say here, by this time the DNA, in a sense, of the Indic Renaissance culture had for over 5 centuries had this time to germinate within Tibet. So in the 13th and 14th centuries, once they'd sort of taken stock and realized what had happened in Tibet, that they suddenly were the heirs to this tradition and it was done in India, what happened was Tibetan scholars such as Rigbe Raldri and Bhutan then compiled all the Tibetan translations of verified Sanskrit texts, which sort of encoded this Enlightenment DNA. Up till this time, they had no idea that this was going to need to be an effort. There was lots and lots of Sanskrit manuscripts and lots of texts purporting to be translations of Sanskrit manuscripts floating around Tibet. Now they suddenly realized they had to organize all this material, edit it, authenticate it, or figure out if some of them were forgeries and so forth. So there's a massive bibliographic project that the Tibetans undertook at this time. The resulting textual collections then were preserved in Tibetan monastic universities, as I said, as the Tibetan Kongyurs and Tengyurs. I put that in plural because there are several different redactions or editions, you could say, of the Kongyur and of the Tengyur. About 7 or so today. For the most part, they represent the same text, but some editions of the Kongyur Tengyur contain a few texts that other editions don't, and vice versa, or they contain duplicate texts, or they contain different translations of the same text. So it's quite a jigsaw puzzle to piece together. That's why the numbers sometimes change. It's about 2,000 and 4,000, depending on which editions you're looking at. So the Tengir contains authoritative Tibetan translations of about 4,000 classical Sanskrit works written by about 700 Indian authors. So these are mere drops from the original Indic Ocean of millions of texts, but these were quintessential drops nonetheless. We can assume that the Indians and Tibetans had several centuries to figure out which texts they thought were the most important. That's not to say that many important texts weren't lost forever, but certainly the ones they thought were absolutely critical to the sort of DNA of this Renaissance culture were translated during these centuries. So that's what we have left. So as far as the Tengir sections go then, the Tengir itself is divided into 17 sections. I'm giving you here the Sanskrit in Tibetan, Stotra, Tutsok in Tibetan, Tantra, Gyu in Tibetan, Prajnaparamita, Madhyamaka, Sutra, Chittamatra. These will be terms that will be familiar to some of you if you've been studying Buddhism for some time. Pramana, and so forth. If not, the English translations of these categories are here. So hymns of praise, Tantra would be inner science, esoteric commentaries and treatises, yogic texts, meditative texts. Prajnaparamita, transcendent wisdom commentaries, and Madhyamaka, central philosophy treatises. These are extremely important in terms of Buddhist philosophy, deconstructive Buddhist philosophy, of which quite a bit of comparative studies have been going on in the Western academies for several decades now, comparing them to deconstructive thought and philosophy of language like Derrida and Wittgenstein and others. Remarkable intersections there. Sutra, of course, Chittamatra, another philosophical system that is sometimes called mind-only, but it's not only mind-only, it's also psychological treatises in general. Abhidharma are very analytical texts, Vinaya having to do with discipline and ethics, Jataka are life stories of the Buddha, and so forth. You can see all these categories here. So the Tengir, the 4,000 texts, are divided into these 17 categories. If we look at this then as a pie chart, percentage-wise, in terms of volumes, we're going to look at this in terms of volumes and texts and pages. Because if you see, for example, in the shrine room here, you can see both the Kangyur and Tengir. Every shrine room will have a Kangyur and Tengir. So you've seen these large Tibetan books that open up and read like this. That would be a volume. A single volume might contain, it might be one text, but it also might be 30 texts, 30 short texts. So it's one thing to look at volumes, it's another thing to look at numbers of texts, it's another thing to actually count pages, and we're going to look at each one. So here we can see percentage by volumes, which is kind of the least useful way to look at the data. And there's a piece of the pie chart missing there. The biggest piece is what? Aha, Tantra. 30% of the volumes are in Tantra, which may be not surprising, again, given that this was such a major area of study and practice in this late period of Indian Buddhism. So that's looking at Tengir volumes by volumes. If you look at Tengir folios, pages, this gives you a much more accurate count. The numbers change a little bit. You'll see certain numbers are bigger than other ones. And again, missing piece of the puzzle is Tantra, 32% if you count pages. Another useful way to look at the same data may be actually to stack up these pages. If you stack up the pages, you get a chart that looks something like this. So Tengir folio sides by count, if you count them, you can see the far left category would be Tantra. There's about 47,128 folio sides on Tantra. Then way down, the next category is supplementary, sort of miscellaneous texts. And beneath that, you get Pramana, which is logic and epistemology. And then you can watch the numbers go down from here as we move into Madhyamaka, Jataka, Prajnaparamita, wisdom, Chittamatra, mind only, and psychology, and so forth as we go down. So a lot of pages, a lot of written on each of these categories, but clearly the largest 2 or 3 categories are going to be Tantra, miscellaneous, logic and epistemology, and Madhyamaka thought. So if we look at this then, a couple more graphs before we move on. I did an analysis myself, working with some data from Paul Hackett at Columbia and from Phil Stanley at Nalanda University. We compiled data and came up with some comparison between the Tibetan and Chinese canons. And again, the only reason this is useful to look at is because it's sometimes thought among not only scholars who don't know any better, but also certainly practitioners. And in particular, interestingly, practitioners and scholars in China don't know this. They sort of assume that they got the bulk of what was available in Indian Buddhism. And they figure, well, maybe there were so few things that made it into Tibet that we never got. but they're not really quite aware, both in China or in the West, of how much discrepancy there is. I mentioned that earlier on, because of just historically when things went from India to China and when they stopped. So if we look just at what are called sutra genres and tantra genres, sutra genres just means exoteric in general, so anything that's not tantric. So exoteric genres in terms of the Kangir, you have 51,000 folios, 46 in the Chinese. It's about a 90%, so they got most of that, of exoteric. This is of Buddha, of things the Buddha actually said. This is Kangir texts. In terms of esoteric or tantric texts, they got about 29%, quite a bit less. This is actual tantras spoken by the Buddha, an average of about 74%. If you look at that in terms of a bar graph, it looks like this. In the front, the red, in all the following graphs, the red is the Chinese canon, the yellow is the Tibetan canon. So you can see in terms of, there's a little bit of discrepancy there, a pretty big discrepancy in terms of the tantra genres of Kangir texts, or texts spoken by the Buddha. When we move to the Tengir, the Shastras, the commentaries written, the discrepancy becomes much, much bigger. So here again in graph, in a table form, sutra genres, you can see about 11%. And in terms of Tantra, it's 0.01%. So the total Tengir, 6.82%, is what the Chinese got. So over 90%, over 95% of what's preserved in the Tibetan Tengirs, of the Indian texts, of the Indian commentaries and treatises, did not make it into China ever. So there's a massive need not only to translate these texts into contemporary languages, which is what our project I'll be discussing later is working on, but also actually to translate them into Chinese and other contemporary languages, Hindi, Russian, European languages, and so forth. So there's actually quite a few Chinese Buddhist traditions and Chinese universities and scholars now interested in working with us to sort of recover this and to see how it informs and adds to Chinese Buddhist traditions. So again, if we look at this in terms of a graph, that's what you get. Again, gigantic discrepancy in terms of Sanskrit commentaries that were not translated into Chinese, that were translated into Tibetan. If you do the totals, adding the Kangir and Tengir together, it's about a 27% is what made it over. And that graph looks like this, adding Kangir and Tengir together. So clearly the biggest discrepancy is in this, the Tengir or the Shastric literature. If we break it down by genre, we saw a minute ago the Tengir can be broken into 17 subcategories. If you want to look real quickly at a graph that sort of shows you that, in terms of subcategories, it looks like this. This is for the Kangir then, for the Buddhist exoteric material. And you know, I know this is very small and you probably can't read it. If you want in discussion, question and answer, we can come back to this and we can discuss it. But what's even more shocking is when we look at the Tengir literature, that's what it looks like. And actually, I say here, I don't know if you can see towards the bottom, Tantric's not even counted. You remember it was 0.01%? It was 5 folios compared to, what was it, some 60, I forget off the top of it, 120 something folios in Tibetan. Basically, my chart here goes up to 16,000. You would have to, in order to, it would have to go 3 times as high in order to include the Tantric bar on here. Imagine a yellow bar 3 times as high as any of those. That's the Tantric Shastric literature in Tibetan. And 5 folios would be just a little thin red line at the bottom for the Chinese. So as far as translating and publishing the Tibetan Tengir goes, which is what we're working on, there's an organization called the American Institute of Buddhist Studies, the mission statement of which is to create and support the necessary institutional framework within which to produce critical, readable, contemporary translations of the 4,000 classical source texts of the liberating arts and sciences, of the Indo-Tibetan civilization preserved in the Tibetan Tengir and its associated literature. So there's this institution set up actually at the behest, at the request of the Dalai Lama and Bob Thurman. Bob Thurman set this up at the behest of the Dalai Lama and his own Mongolian teacher, Geshe Wangyal, in 1972. This has been its mandate ever since then. And in terms of the publications of these translations, finished annotated translations and studies are being co-published with the Columbia University Center for Buddhist Studies in Tibet House, US, right here. So 3 organizations are collaborating. American Institute of Buddhist Studies, founded for the express purpose of translating and publishing these texts, in collaboration with the Columbia University Center for Buddhist Studies and Tibet House, US. This is the group that's actually doing this work now. We are, of course, affiliating with other institutions around the country. You'll see the Central University of Tibetan Studies in India, various places in Taiwan and elsewhere that we're collaborating with. Of course, many scholars around the world, but in terms of institutional collaboration, those are some of the bigger ones. This is a letter of support that His Holiness the Dalai Lama wrote for our initiative. I'll be quoting more from him in a minute. In that particular letter that he wrote for us, he said, in this letter he says, the Buddhist culture that flourished in Tibet can rightly be seen to derive from the pure tradition of Nalanda, which comprises the most complete presentation of the Buddhist teachings. As for me personally, I consider myself a practitioner of Nalanda tradition of wisdom. So that is a phrase he uses to describe himself. In the same letter he goes on to say, the works of these Nalanda masters are presently preserved in the Tengir. The Tengir is truly one of Tibet's most precious treasures, a mine of understanding that we have preserved in Tibet for the benefit of the whole world. So he says, I see myself as a monk first, then as a practitioner of the Nalanda tradition of wisdom. At this point, I don't say that I belong to the Hinayana or the Mahayana traditions, but to the lineage of Nalanda. This is something he said in 2001. An amazing quote, really, when we think about it. You would think the Dalai Lama certainly would say, you know, number one, if anything else, he's a Buddhist, right? He's just a humble Buddhist monk, he sometimes says, or I'm just a human being. But in terms of some sort of affiliation, you would think, if nothing else, he's a Buddhist monk, and of course he's a Mahayana Buddhist monk. That's what he is. But he actually says, I don't even say anymore that I belong to the Hinayana and the Mahayana traditions, primarily. That's not his main identity. But rather that he belongs to the lineage of Nalanda. So that's how strongly he considers Tibetan in general and himself to be tied to this particular tradition. So, guidance and advice for translation. One of the first conferences that we participated in, there was actually one before this. Then there was this particular conference was in Dharamsala, India in 2009. You can see a group of us there meeting with His Holiness. There were many others who were at this conference, but this was the group who came to his personal residence to have a conversation with him to get. This was a group of an international group of translators who were translating everything, Kangir, Tengir, and Tibetan texts. So everything there is to translate. And we, after having a conference about this, we then sort of went up to Dharamsala. The conference itself was in Bir, India, nearby, in northern India. We then went, the Dalai Lama invited us graciously to his residence to discuss further and get his advice on how we should go about all of these translation projects. So we asked, we requested advice, and we said, and this is what's now typed here is a transcript. This was all audio recorded and video recorded. So the audio recording of our meeting with him was then typed up, and this is a transcript of what went on there. So one of our spokespeople said, within 100 years, we, that's the international community of translators assembled for this translation conference, would like to translate the words of the Buddha, the commentaries of the great Panditas, that's the Tengir, and also all the commentaries of the writings of all the great Tibetan masters, all three layers, right? We'd very much like to request His Holiness for guidance. So, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, on the contemporary value and relevancy of Buddhism in general due to its emphasis on reason and explanation, said the following. This is now him speaking, transcript of what he said. He said, among the different traditions, I think all the major religions have the same potential to help humanity. But for those people who are generally a little bit skeptical about religion and who aren't easily convinced about God or such things, then Buddhism can help. Even among Buddhists who have a keen interest in Buddhism, there are still many who are skeptical about a next life. In such a period, I think, certainly Buddhism may have greater potential to help such people who love reasons and explanations. Saints like Nagarjuna, Dignaga, Dharmakirti, and many of the great masters presented the Buddha's teaching through reasoning and through logic. Therefore, I think that these teachings are very relevant to today's world, where many people are skeptical about religion. And he goes on to say, Buddhism can be like a bridge between radical materialism and spirituality. And he says, I cannot say radical spirituality, but rather spirituality that is based on faith alone. And there's an important distinction he's making here. If you ask a radical spiritualist further questions, then they will say there's something inexpressible and inconceivable. Buddhism's not that way. So he's sort of defining a radical spiritualist, somebody who's not necessarily a fundamentalist person, but a person whose spiritual or religious belief is based on faith. And if you ask them to sort of defend their position, they say, well, I can't defend it, it's just what I believe. I can't give any reasons, it's just based on my faith. And he's saying Buddhism is not that way. Buddhists in general do not just say, well, it's just a matter of faith. Rather, all the great Buddhist masters try to make things clear through reasoning that is based on our own experience. And this is a big difference between Buddhist traditions and many other traditions. So now another topic here, the Dalai Lama on the contemporary value and relevancy of Buddhism in general and of the Nalanda tradition in particular due to its development of debate. He said, quote, "The other day some Tibetan students were debating downstairs in the main temple in Dharamsala, demonstrating a dialectical debate. At that time, in front of His Holiness Sakya-Tritsen, the head of the Sakya order, and His Holiness Karmapa Rinpoche, head of the Kagyapa order, and all the important leaders, I, the Dalai Lama, said that maybe it's now worthwhile for us to think about the use of similar techniques of debate applied not to traditional Buddhist topics, but to modern subjects in general." Something that, by the way, he's gone on to institute in Tibetan monasteries throughout India, bringing in Western sciences and arts and sciences into the curriculum, and also then trying to export Buddhist dialectical techniques, reasoning techniques, to hopefully get back into the Western discussions and academies. He goes on to say, quote, the masters writing from the 4th to the 8th centuries in India picked up examples and subject matter relevant to those times, right? Now, times have changed, so maybe we can use the same methods, but with different subject matter. For example, subjects that are currently important, including economics. My belief is that the Buddha Dharma in general, and particularly the Nalanda tradition, is very relevant to today's world. So, he said a lot of really important things there, and there's going to be a couple other important quotes from him coming up in a minute, but he didn't exactly yet answer our question about, okay, how do we prioritize what text to translate? So, we reiterated the question to him after this wonderful discourse. Okay, can you please give us some guidance still about how to prioritize these thousands and thousands of texts? Right, we'd like your guidance on which text we should translate first. So, next topic, the Dalai Lama on the priority of translating the Indian Shastras, interestingly, the Tengyur, over the Tibetan commentaries and even over the Buddha's word. Kind of shocking at first. You would think he would say, well, you translate the Buddha's word first, and then on that, the commentaries, and then on that, sort of chronologically, that would seem to make the most sense. He actually says, no, the middle category, the Tengyur, the Shastras, should really take priority, and the reasons he gives are quite compelling and interesting. He said, I think as far as the Tibetan Buddhism is concerned, the root texts all come from India. These root texts are in the Tengyur. I think that the Tengyur corpus is better to prioritize for translation than Tibetan commentaries, as far as priority goes. Of course, the works of individual Tibetan lamas are wonderful, but all their different comments and should be translated. He did say, absolutely, those of you who that's your thing, you want to translate, then individuals, by all means, go ahead and translate that. But in terms of general advice for an international body of translators, this is kind of where he's steering people. But the problem with all the Tibetan discourse, the Tibetan indigenous commentaries, is that their different commentaries are based on the original, they're based on the original Indian text. But when we perform these translations of the Indian texts, there's no need for accounting for diverse interpretations given by the different Tibetan traditions as red hat, yellow hat. I put that in brackets. He just said yellow hat, red hat, or blue hat. As some of you know, in Tibet, there's the Gelugpa order, which are sometimes called the yellow hats because they wear yellow. The other three orders, the Nyingma, Kagyu, and Sakya, all wear red hats. And each of these different Tibetan traditions has 1,000 years of tradition, which of themselves commenting on these Indian texts, and slightly different traditions emerge, and sometimes very different traditions emerge. So if you translate an Indian text, a Shastra by Nagarjuna or by Chandakirti on logic or on meditation or on whatever, if you use a Tibetan commentary to translate that text to sort of help you understand what it's saying, you're going to actually come out with a very different translation if you rely on a Kagyupa commentary from the 1800s as opposed to a Gelugpa commentary from the 1500s or a Sakya commentary from the 1900s. It'll give you enough of a sort of a different angle on it that your translation will come out very differently. So that's kind of, that's inherently problematic. There's no way to get around that. But the advice here is that we should try to focus on the Shastric texts themselves without being too influenced or biased by Tibetan commentaries. Although in practice, what we have found and most scholars we work with find it's so helpful to use the Tibetan commentaries that you kind of can't ignore them. And therefore, what you have to try to do, even if your main project is to translate an Indian text, is to be self-aware of what Tibetan commentaries you're using. Maybe ideally use multiple Tibetan commentaries. And whatever translation you come out with, be very, very upfront in your introductory matter and in your footnotes how your translation is being affected by the lens of which Tibetan traditions. And that's why translations, we believe, it's very important, are not just, you don't just translate a text and put it out there. What we consider a good translation to be is really a book that includes usually something like a 100-page introduction that really contextualizes, shows the history of the text, shows your methodology, shows what other commentaries you're relying on, and a lot of other sort of scholarly matter and footnotes to contextualize and to show and to be honest where your translation is coming from. This also means somebody else could do, and we've seen this, right? There's been multiple translations of Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara, Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamaka Karkas on wisdom. Oftentimes there's not that much of a difference, but sometimes on key points, on really tricky points of philosophy, you end up with very different understandings of what's going on in the text. So you can come out with different translations, and that's fine. But for a translation to be really useful and to stand the test of time, we believe it needs to be properly contextualized. So as you'll see later on when we talk about this, we're not just interested in paying a translator, working with a single translator to translate a text and give it to us and we just publish it. We're interested in usually a team of scholars working both in Tibetan and Sanskrit, using Western disciplines, informed in Western philosophy or psychology or whatever the relevant disciplines are, and aware historically of where this text is situated. So what we publish might be a 200-page translation with a 100-page introduction, a whole bunch of footnotes, and a glossary and a bunch of other material to really hopefully make that text as useful and as honest as possible. So he goes on, individual organizations and individual people will, of course, conduct various individual translations. That's fine. But it may be better for a bigger body like this, comprised of coordinated translators from the 84,000 group, American Institute of Buddhist Studies, and so forth, to concentrate on the Tangyur, as that's the root text. Now, still, why? I put the next couple slides with a little gold halo around them, because you can barely see the gold halo. But this is where his argument comes in, which is really quite interesting as to why that's the case, why he thinks we should focus on that middle strata. So the topic here is the Dalai Lama on the priority of translating the Indian Shastras in the Tangyur over the Tibetan commentaries and over the Kangyur for that matter, emphasizing the importance of the unique multicultural context in India. Usually I have the feeling, this is the Dalai Lama speaking again, usually I have the feeling that Tibetan masters' writings were written in Tibet, right? So their main audience is obviously Tibetans. And among Tibetans, there are generally no non-Buddhists. So the Lama or writer takes for granted that his writings are meant for Buddhists. Whereas in the Indian writings, Nagarjuna, Shantarakshita, Chandrakirti never take for granted that their audience is only Buddhists. That's a big difference, and you can see the differences in the way the Buddha Dharma is presented. So that makes sense, right? Having seen what we talked about earlier with this really multidisciplinary university system they had in India, which was nominally or ostensibly run by Buddhists, but in which you had professors and students studying all different traditions and even non-religious secular traditions. They're all debating with each other over everything. So if Nagarjuna, Chandrakirti, Aryadevi, any of these Indian pundits were writing a text, they knew their audience was multicultural, multidisciplinary. They couldn't just take it for granted that we all agree on these 29 Buddhist things. They had to make their case to a very diverse audience. Whereas in Tibet, that wasn't the case. So Tibetan texts are going to be intrinsically less aware of that spectrum, and therefore they don't have to argue their case as much. So that's one big argument. So for example, Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara, Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, is primarily dedicated towards one's personal practice. But during his presentation, there's quite often some sort of argument involved, and his Indian audience was made up of different faiths. Whereas Tibetan lamas and masters take for granted that their audience was Buddhist, so the way they present things is a little bit different. He goes on. Next topic, on the importance of studying the Tibetan Tangyur and of prioritizing its translation then. Of course, the Kangyur, the Buddha's own words, is again something like a root text. But for study, for example, with the Prajnaparamita, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, I think the Tangyur is better. There's a danger that we will be hardly able to understand what's in there in the Kangyur if we don't translate the Tangyur alongside the Kangyur and depend on the interpretations from the Tangyur. So here he's saying the Buddha's own words, and this is, if you've ever read a sutra all by itself or tried to translate one, you know it's sometimes very, very difficult to understand, particularly if it's a very concise sutra. You basically need the Indian commentarial tradition to unpack it. They were actually written that way on purpose sometimes. The word sutra is oftentimes means a very condensed, almost like a mnemonic, sometimes very, very short, pithy things that have to be, they're made for memorizing, each one of which is a short phrase which then unpacks into a huge long paragraph. And you need the commentary to unpack that. So you actually kind of need that even if you're going to translate a sutra or a text by the Buddha oftentimes, not always, but often. So for study purposes, for Western students, I think he's suggesting here, since we were talking largely with him about translating things into Western languages, for study, it's actually maybe better that Westerners study a text by Nagarjuna or Chandakirti first, and then maybe go back and read the Transcendent Wisdom Sutra itself. That's actually a better way to come to understand what did the Buddha mean when he said, all things are empty, all things are selfless. If you just read all things are empty or all things are selfless, like in the Heart Sutra, what does that mean? That could mean it's not necessarily unpacked fully. In some of the longer sutras, the longer Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, it's unpacked quite fully, but those are oftentimes not translated. Sometimes we only have translations of the concise sutras. So to study Nagarjuna or Chandakirti, it really helps to unpack exactly what does the doctrine of no self mean and what does it not mean. Why is it not nihilistic, for example? For example, without depending on the teachings on emptiness, as explained by Arya Nagarjuna, we can hardly get the gist of the points in the Kangyur. And there's another, so that's kind of what I was just saying, and there's another danger that people might read the Kangyur directly and not get anything out of it. And then they might think, well, what's the point of all these Buddhist teachings? And for example, we need to rely on Arya Nagarjuna and Chandakirti's interpretations on the second turning of the wheel and the teachings of the Prajnaparamita and how these relate to the Buddha's intentions in the third turning of the wheel. He's getting to some very specific doctrinal differences here. We need their commentaries to be able to distinguish which parts of the Buddha's own teachings are emphasized in the view of the mind-only school and which in the Madhyamaka view, sort of a comparative hermeneutical issue here. Without being able to rely on these Tangyur commentaries, we can get confused if we simply read the Kangyur. So, next topic then, on the timelines of beginning such a massive translation initiatives, when should we get about doing this? How urgent is this priority? He says, quote, so this task of translating the entire Kangyur and the Tangyur and all the Tibetan commentaries is not easy, and it may take several generations. We Tibetans have now been refugees for 50 to 60 years. Although such a huge, big task will take generations, this is the right time to start. Then when my generation goes, there will be younger people who will follow and carry this sacred task. The present generation needs to start and they will follow. And there was more conversation about that, but there was really quite a sense of urgency, and we've also expressed this in our own appeals and so forth for funding. The fact that we have a critical mass of scholars now in the West and in India who are really trained and translated and able to do this kind of translation work. And we also have a shrinking number of Tibetan masters who are from Tibet, like His Holiness the Dalai Lama and others, many of whom now have passed away. And you can do a remarkably good translation if you can have a team comprised of a Western translator, maybe 2 or 3, a Sanskritist from India, and one of these great Tibetan masters who actually knows this tradition, was actually raised in it and lived it and breathed it and so forth, and can really give the commentary on what the text means and doesn't mean when it's confusing. But these masters are dying. They're dying fast. I mean, probably more than half of them are gone in my lifetime. So there really is an urgency in terms of there's sort of a window now of 10 or 20 or 30 years. Of course, there will continue to be Tibetans trained in the tradition in the universities in India and so forth, but it's different. Those who are trained in pre-1959 Tibet, where they really were steeped in it. So then just to give you a quick overview of kind of the work we're doing, in terms of a model we've come up with for what does it take to translate an average, if there is such a thing, as an average Tangyur text, the kinds we're working on. If you said a medium text is about 350 folios, that would be 700 folio sides, right? We estimate about, on average, a translation of 1 folio side per day, 6 hours. What that means, if you look at a Tibetan folio, you can whip off a rough translation. Maybe if you're fluent and you know the subject matter, you might be able to whip off a translation in 30 minutes. Why it's 6 hours is because turning that over the course of time, this is on average, right? You might translate 20 folios, 6 minutes each, or a few minutes each, but then you're going to go back, revise the translation, you're going to look up the commentaries, You're going to put in footnotes. If that text is quoting something else, which they often are, because these are extremely intertextual texts, these Indian Shastric commentaries will oftentimes be quoting other authors and other sutras. Sometimes you have to look up hundreds of quotes in a single text of this size. So on average then, by the time you've actually translated, done all the scholarly work to actually present that with all the apparatus, it's on average, let's say 6 hours. So then you can do the math. 330 folio sides per year if you have a 2,000 hour year. That means it takes 2.1 years to complete, one person to do this. If you're paying $225 per folio side, you can calculate that person's making $75,000 a year. That's if they're doing this full-time, living wage in the West. So more on editing and production costs. The total number of texts in the Tangyur is about 4,000. The total number of folio sides is that. And you can just quickly, this is the kind of calculations we've done to figure out how big this project is. We just said 6 hours per folio side for translation, roughly another 3 hours for editors to work on that text to bring it to actually the publication. So about 9 hours. As we run down the numbers, you can do it by hours, by days, by years. You'll see here it would take about 651 years to complete the task. This is if you have one person working on it at any one time, one translator, one editor at any one time. Obviously, if you have 10 translators and 10 editors, 651 years becomes 65 years. If you can get 20 people working on it full time at any given years, it goes down to 30 years. And that's our goal, actually, is to get this thing done in 30 years by having a team of 20 people. It doesn't have to be the same 20 people. Probably a core of 5 who oversee the project up at Columbia and with our affiliates in India, and then a rotating teams of people, but 20 at any one time to get it done in 30 years. And what is that? If you do the flat fee of $225 and editing of $75, you end up with a basic cost of about $43 million. Sounds like a lot to some of us, but again, when you look at budgets for doing research in genetics or anything, it's like a nothing, a drop in the bucket. And by the time you add in, there's a lot of other overhead, computer equipment, flying people around, hosting conferences like the ones we'll be talking about or we talked about a minute ago. When you add everything together, it's about 70 million by the time and that includes publication costs, marketing, distributing, website materials, and so forth. So 70 million is the bottom line. The entire Tangyur is done in 30 years. So if any of you know anybody with even a partial, part of the 70 million, we would love to talk to you, because as important, historically important as this project is, and as we have been generously funded by some people and some institutions and foundations, we're still very, very far from this goal. We're trying to scale up right now, actually. Now, of the entire Tangyur, that's a huge project. Again, is there a way that we could narrow that down, sort of do a proof of concept, and so forth? And His Holiness did help us with that as well. In fact, he wrote a text called Illuminating the Threefold Faith and Invocation of the 17 Great Scholars of Glorious Nalanda. He wrote this in 2001. So he identified, you remember there were about 700 authors who wrote the text in the Tangyur. Of those 700, he identified 17 himself that he thought were particularly important. In the colophon to this invocation, he explains, the foremost scholars of the Holy Land of India have composed numerous excellent, meaningful texts that can open the eyes of those possessing fine discriminative awareness. More than 2,500 years have passed, but still these teachings entailing learning, contemplation, and meditation survive undiminished. Therefore, I recollect the kindness of those who were the cream of scholars, and I aspire to them with unflinching faith. It's extremely important for those of us who follow the Buddha to have faith, but not just faith, faith based on knowledge of his teaching. Therefore, we should examine the reasons for such faith knowledge with an unbiased and inquisitive mind, analyzing those reasons closely. Again, this is in the colophon to his text. If we're to develop faith supported by an understanding of the reasons, those excellent texts concerning the profound and vast by such renowned masters among the 6 ornaments and the 2 supremes are indispensable. Here he's referring to 6 ornaments and 2 supremes are 6 and 2, that's 8 authors who are a well-known set, Nagarjuna, Aryadeva, Chandrakirti, and so on. There's a well-known set of 8 Indian authors that everyone has, for centuries, considered to be the most important 8. So he's expanded that set of 8 to 17, essentially. So he then goes on to say, with this in mind, I had a new Tonka painting composed depicting the 17 scholarly adepts of Nalanda. This collection was achieved by adding 9 teachers to the existing 8 that I just mentioned, as a way of depicting, in addition to the 2 ornaments and the 2 supremes, 6 ornaments and 2 supremes. Consequently, I developed an urge to compose an invocation with wholehearted respect for each of these supreme scholars, and have developed unfeigned conviction in the superb works of these sublime masters. So you can find this text, it's been translated into English, about a verse or so on each of these masters and why he considers each one important. So, and you'll see who those 17 are in just a minute. There was this international translation. I mentioned the one in 2009. We hosted our own American Institute of Buddhist Studies, hosted a conference at the Central University of Tibetan Studies as a follow-up in 2011, just a few years ago. And His Holiness came to this. You can barely see the picture here, but His Holiness attended. You saw some slides going by there. And at this conference, we continued the conversation. So we organized, based on being inspired by his writing this invocation prayer about the 17 Pandits, we decided, of the Tengyur, which is a huge project to start, are we just going to start randomly, how are we going to choose? We decided we'll focus on the 17 Pandits, since these seem to be ones identified by the Dalai Lama as most important. Hence, our conference that we held in 2011 was called Translating the Text of the 17 Pandits. So we held this international conference on this precise project. And the actual Pandits themselves, given the order of His Holiness invocation, are these: Nagarjuna, Aryadeva, Buddhapalita, Bhaviviveka, Chandrakirti, Shantideva, Shantarakshata, Kamalashila, Sangha, Vasubandhu, Dignaga, Dharmakirti, Vimuktasena, Haribhadra, Guna Prabha, Shakya Prabha, and Atisha. A total of 491 texts in total out of the 4,000. About 24,000 folio sides. This is about 16.8% of the Tengyur. So that's our initial project. Again, if you look at this subsect in a pie chart, I'll sort of go through this quickly, but you can see in terms of by author, Nagarjuna wrote about 30% of these texts, Atisha 26%, and so forth. By folio side, the numbers redistribute a little bit. The other one was by text. This is now by folio sides. And again, if you look at it in terms of folio size in a bar graph, it looks like this. You can see Nagarjuna has the greatest number of texts, Atisha the second largest number of texts of the 491. But again, if you look at folio sides, which, because text can be very short or very long, folio sides gives you more of a sense of the quantity. It looks like this. So here you see things shift a bit. Asanga actually wrote the most in terms of words and folios, followed by Haribhadra, Vasubandhu, Gunaprabha, Kamalashila, Nagarjuna there, Chandrakirti, and so on. So another way that we can look at this then is text percentages by genre, a different way. Remember, there were 17 genres, and not to be confusing here, but it's a coincidence. There were 17 genres, right, within the Tengyur that we looked at a while ago, and there happened to be 17 Pandits, but the number 17 is a coincidence. 17 genres, you'll remember then. Here I have the Sanskrit terms, so Tantra, Madhyamakas, philosophy, Chittamatra is mind only and psychology, and so forth. Vinaya would be ethics and monastic discipline. So in terms of texts written by these guys, the percentage works out this way, but in terms of folio count, which again gives you more quantitative, a large number in Chittamatra, fair amount in Prajnaparamita, 10% in Tantra, smaller than you might expect, and a large amount in Madhyamaka, 22%. And again, if you line up that in terms of a bar graph, it just looks like this, different way of presenting the same data. This is by texts. The largest number is in Tantra, but by folios, the largest number is in Madhyamaka, and Tantra moves down to 5th or 6th place. So if we look at then our timing and our expense for the specific sub-project, it looks like this, similar chart to what I showed you before. So here it comes down to about 7 million. With the added other things I mentioned, it's about 11 million. That's doing everything, including, again, including the publication itself, some extra editing, website material, advertising, conference hosting, flying scholars back and forth, and so forth. It's about 11 million to do this initial project, which we hope, if we can get the funding, to do in 10 years. So it would be, if the entire Tengyur is 30 years, we're doing about 16% of it in 10 years. But the idea is that once we've done that 16%, things are ramped up, the wheels have been greased so well that then we can increase production, increase staff and production even more in the remaining 20 years to hopefully get the whole thing done in 30 years. Another nice way, interesting way to look at it is simply by, in terms of breaking down expense per author. We had in mind there might be some people who, you know, philanthropists who might be interested, particularly they have a soft spot for, let's say, Kamala Shila, and they say, I'd like to sponsor all of your Kamala Shila texts. Well, we can tell them that'll be $653,000 to translate Kamala Shila. This is for the basic. See, this comes down to the $7 million figure. This is the basic figure, not the slightly larger figure. That's if you want to do it by author, and again by genre, it would look like this. Madhyamaka is the largest genre in terms of folios, so it would cost this much. $1.5 million to translate all the Madhyamaka texts. So I'm about done here. I just have a couple final thoughts, and then we can have questions and answers and discussion. Some ramifications for translating the Tengyur. So as we saw, the Nalanda tradition texts, and Nalanda tradition, by the way, is this larger tradition of the 5 or 6 or so Indian universities in northern India. And what His Holiness the Dalai Lama refers to as the 17 Pandits of Nalanda, he's referring to, really it's the 17 Pandits of the Nalanda tradition. They were at various different, some of them, many of them were at Nalanda, but not all of them. But they were all part of this sort of network of universities. So the Nalanda tradition includes that whole network. So we know that the Nalanda tradition texts were developed and refined in a cosmopolitan, multicultural, multilingual milieu. That they were developed and refined in a Renaissance Enlightenment culture. We haven't had much time to talk about that, but really this period in Indian history is really quite remarkable. It really is a real Renaissance period. And the kind of Renaissance that was triggered in Tibet thereafter is remarkable. That what happened to the country of Tibet is astounding. And likewise in East Asia earlier on. So the DNA, the sort of concepts, the teachings within these texts really do have this potential, if well understood and brought into a culture, to really trigger what we would probably consider something like a Renaissance, a second or third Renaissance, maybe a global Renaissance, as opposed to a regional Renaissance. So these Nalanda tradition texts were developed and refined in liberal arts institutions, using a multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary approaches and paradigms for diverse audiences, both religious and secular, both Buddhist and non-Buddhist. So that we know that about this material. And therefore, we argue that to do justice to this tradition, contemporary translations of these texts likewise should reflect this. They need to be developed for a multicultural global target audience, using multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary approaches, referencing and interrelating to contemporary intellectual traditions, disciplines, practices, methodologies, thinkers, terminologies, and so forth. Hence what I was saying earlier on about the need for these translations to really be well documented and commented upon. And thus, in order to accomplish that, contemporary translators of these texts must be trained accordingly. They need to be not only bilingual or multilingual, as the case may be, but actually bicultural or multicultural and multidisciplinary, if that makes sense, ideally. In other words, not just ivory tower scholars who can look up words in dictionaries, but who've actually traveled to these places, lived among Tibetans and Indians, worked with them, and likewise from the Indian side and the Tibetan side, having come to the West and are well enough informed about Western disciplines and traditions that we can really cross-fertilize and come out with meaningful translations. So further ramifications then for translating the Tengyur today. So it's now the time, as His Holiness said, that we make a paradigm shift in our outlook, embarking on such massive projects as translating the Tibetan Tengyur. There's an enormous global pool of talent now and unprecedented technical resources at our disposal. We can do this, can do. We must learn to think big, to take a can-do attitude. As His Holiness the Dalai Lama said, this is the right time to start. Moreover, we can and must do this in a way that does justice to the Nalanda tradition by creating critical, accessible, and contemporarily relevant translations and studies of the Tibetan Tengyur texts. By doing so carefully, responsibly, authoritatively, and yet efficiently, we can look forward to stimulating our own modern global Renaissance culture. That's our hope. Sarvamangalam. All is well.
What is the entire universe of people that would be considered competent to do this? I If we count them all, are we talking hundreds?
Hundreds, not thousands. Hundreds, and it's a little bit difficult to come up with an immediate answer because there's such different skill sets. I would say there's probably in Western universities, at least 100. There are scholars who maybe even do a PhD in Tibetan Buddhism, but only take their Tibetan language skills so far, maybe enough to do a dissertation, but then they don't keep it up for whatever reason. So there are Tibetans maybe a little bit rusty after 15 years. They could certainly help do research, but they may not be absolutely fluent. So there's quite a range of Western trained scholars with quite a range of fluency in Tibetan. Some are bilingual. Some can look up words in dictionaries and have enough of a sense of the tradition that they would do a good translation, but it would take them longer. So somewhere between, I would say, 100 and 300 who are competent Tibetan. Probably similar numbers in Sanskrit, but there the difference is they have to be well-versed in Buddhist Sanskrit, which is somewhat different than Vedic Sanskrit and classical. It's written in classical Sanskrit. You have to know classical Sanskrit. But there's also what's called Buddhist hybrid Sanskrit. The Buddhists themselves sometimes wrote in a sort of hybrid version of Sanskrit, so it helps if a Sanskrit scholar is schooled in that. And then likewise, from the Tibetan side, there are fewer Tibetans and Indian scholars, probably more Indian scholars, but fewer Tibetan scholars who are well versed in Western disciplines. An example, a Renaissance person who's a perfect example, what we would love there be more of would be Thupten Jinpa, who is a Tibetan, who was a monk for many years, just sort of a small monk in a large monastery in southern India, but was sort of picked out for his real brilliance and sort of rose up through the ranks on his own merits, and was eventually asked to be and he learned English on his own in a Tibetan monastery in southern India, and his English became so good that His Holiness Dalai Lama came to be aware of him and asked him to translate for him, which was a huge honor, and he was very embarrassed, but he decided to take it on and wound up traveling with the Dalai Lama as his translator, and then wound up from there going on to study. He got his Geshe degree, which is the equivalent of a PhD in that university, PhD in Tibetan Buddhism, and then went on actually to go on at His Holiness's urging, because he was such a brilliant scholar and fluent in English, to get a PhD in the Western system at, I believe it was Oxford. Yes, Oxford. Sometimes I think Cambridge. At Oxford. Got his PhD in philosophy there. His own dissertation is brilliant, written in English on Tsongkhapa's thought. Eventually gave up his monk vows, got married, has 2 kids, now teaches at McGill in Canada, and still translates for the Dalai Lama and is prolific in his writing of books on Buddhism in English and in Tibetan. Not so much a Sanskritist, but he is an ideal Renaissance kind of person we would love to have more of, but there's a handful of those. So Tibetans who really have the equivalent of a PhD in the Tibetan system and the Western system. He's running his own, he's actually on our board of editors for our project, but he's also running his own translation project, which is focused on translating the Tibetan indigenous commentaries. So people like Thupten Jinpa, there's probably just a handful. People who are less skilled in one of the others from the Tibetan side, I don't know off the top of my head, but it's probably less than 100. But certainly there are others. Geshe Samten, who is again now, of course, the Vice Chancellor of Central University of Tibetan Studies. There are other Geshes who are equally skilled. So probably a few hundred on the Western side, maybe 100 on the Tibetan side. In terms of Sanskrit scholars, we've worked with a number from the Central University of Tibetan Studies and elsewhere, like Shrikant Bahukar and others. But again, few of them are conversant in Buddhist Sanskrit. But around the world at any one time, again, if you patch this together, we certainly could have at any one time 20 or 30 scholars working at any one time in different configurations. So I hope that's a...
Is the pool being replenished?
The pool is being replenished, yes. I mean, there's more and more PhDs being produced in the West. There's more and more Geshes being produced in the Tibetan system. As you know, there's not so much Buddhist Sanskrit scholars being produced in India, but there's some. So yes, it's being replenished, and again, it's a mixed bag in the sense that the pool is being replenished, but it's being replenished in an academic system in the West that is increasingly competitive, which means whereas I had the luxury of taking 10 years to do my MA, MPhil, and PhD work, and really spend that amount of time studying the material in an academic setting, separate from my studies with Tibetans, which took place over another 20, 30 years. students now in the system are expected to get in and out in 5 years, and then they're on the job market, and the jobs are not there. It's a very competitive job market. Probably 1 out of 10 are going to get an ideal job teaching Buddhist studies in a university. Others are going to be doing adjunct teaching, trying to pick up odd jobs here and there, hoping for the best. And in the process, maybe they keep up their language skills, maybe they don't. The good part about that is there's a pool of unemployed scholars that we could actually hire, which is one of the reasons we want to make this a living wage. We'd love to see this be a career path because of the 10-to-1 ratio of scholars out there who aren't getting jobs. We could probably pick the 2 or 3 best ones out of the 10 and hire them on full time. So the pool is being replenished, but who's replenishing it is different than those who've been at it for quite some time. The most valuable ones are the ones who've been doing it for 20 or 30 years. The problem is they're tenured faculty, they have full-time teaching jobs, and it's hard to get them to do any work for a project like this because they have other commitments. Again, that's why rather than the standard model that has been in place till now, which is scholars translate things on their own for free whenever they get the time, we would like to expedite that. And with the funding to be able to go to a scholar who's a tenured faculty member at University of Virginia, one of the California universities, Harvard, Princeton, Columbia, to actually come with some money and say, look, we'll give you a grant. If you can prioritize translating this text, we'll give you however many, whatever the math works out to. Then they're used to doing this work for free. Suddenly they're given $10,000, $20,000. They're, sure, I'll prioritize this. That sounds great. So we'd like to take some of the senior staff, senior faculty, pay them to do it, get some of the talented younger ones and pay them to do it. Sort of a long answer to that, but it's an important question about the pool. So the pool is going to fluctuate a lot, and it's hard to predict what will that pool be in 10 years. If this kind of thing doesn't take off, if the jobs aren't there, the pool could actually shrink in 10 years.
One more
yes, please.
Sure. As between the 17 words and the 17 subjects, if you like.
Yes.
If you had your own way, is there a logical way to order what gets done?
I don't know if you noticed, but in the pie chart I showed by genre, of the 17 texts, or I'm sorry, the 17 genres, when you look at the text written by the 17 pundits, they did not write text on all 17 genres. They wrote text on, I forget, 13 or 14 genres. Of those, it's, they're all equally important for different reasons, although you could certainly make an argument that like monastic Vinaya texts about commentaries on monastic discipline will obviously be of great importance to those pursuing a monastic Buddhist career, but of less importance to a larger public audience. Whereas texts on Madhyamaka philosophy, deconstructive thought, pramana, logic, and epistemology, those will be a great interest to a larger number of people. So if we had to pick and choose, we would probably choose the texts that have the largest relevance to the largest number of disciplines that would make the biggest impact in terms of sort of triggering this sort of idea of a renaissance. We'd like to see Buddhist philosophy and psychology and so forth taught more in universities and also promulgated out more into Dharma centers so that both practitioners and scholars had better access and better understanding of the material. So yes, there are some criteria we could use to adjudicate that and to decide which ones should get priority. And off the top of my head, that would be one of our main priorities probably. But it would also be dependent on demand that we saw coming. If there were individuals or institutions or universities that expressed a demand for a certain genre to be, or a certain author's text to be translated, we could certainly prioritize that as well. Yes? Banu, right? Yes.
Just two guys, I couldn't see all the names, but in those 17 is to Tsongkhapa in the 17?
No, because Tsongkhapa is a Tibetan author.
Oh, is this? Okay.
Yes, so Tsongkhapa is 1357 to 1419 in Tibet, one of the great, important Renaissance Tibetan scholars, real polymath, extremely important. And we certainly read his commentaries. He wrote hundreds of texts, and he wrote many commentaries on many of these texts. But that's that third strata of text I was talking about. So that's a Tibetan scholar, not a Indian. So the Tibetan Tengyur, again, are the Tibetan translations of the Indian texts by Indian authors. That's what we're focusing on. But we certainly use Tsongkhapa's commentaries and others' commentaries carefully when we're looking at these texts. Yes?
I'm not sure the relevance of this, but when I studied religion at a private university, departments. And do public universities, are they allowed to have religion departments now?
Sure. I mean, the study of religion now, in universities you have kind of two flavors. You have religion departments, which are it's considered an academic discipline, as any other academic discipline. Some universities, like Harvard and a few others, have a divinity school, which is an interesting hybrid because, you know, historically that meant they were there to train people to go into the ministry. But they've morphed into really academic institutions where still that can happen, where the understanding is you could still go on and become a minister in one of the faith traditions, but you can also get a degree from a divinity school, and it's basically just an academic degree. There's not an expectation. In either context, pretty much these days it's pretty equal that you're going to get a rigorous critical understanding. You're going to look at the text historically, you're going to criticize. If the received tradition says this text was written by this person on this date, and historically looking at other textual evidence, it appears that's not true. It was written by somebody else, or it was a text brought together by different people. The same kind of critical studies that happen looking at the Bible, you know, as being something that was created and changed over time. The critical study of religious texts and traditions and practices is something that is part of the pedagogy in any university, public or private. As is the field of even if just a few decades ago there was this so-called field of comparative religion. And now what's happened is that field's almost gone away because it basically has gone away. Even the name of the field has gone away because it's expected, if you're going to go get a master's or a PhD in Buddhist studies at any university, it's expected that you will not just study Buddhism. You'll be studying critical approaches to Buddhist texts, but you'll also be studying how does Buddhism interface with the Vedic religion and how might it be interpreted from a Jewish perspective. So you're expected to be doing comparative religious studies no matter what. So comparative religion is sort of folded into the whole project of your training, as is a critical approach, expected. Critical textual and analytical approach. Yes, again.
Is there a serious peer review type of thing for this translation?
Yes, there is.
Besides the editor?
Yep. Well, we have a board of 10 editors who do the majority of the peer reviewing, who look over everything quite carefully, quite a few times. There's an enormous number of actual revisions. It takes a little bit longer than one would even like, but a typical text that, say 400 or 500 pages, from beginning to end takes about 3 years usually. It can be 2 years, it can be 5 years. And a lot of that is because of the amount of reviewing and editing and revising that has to go on. But yes, the peer reviewing and critical editing is a big part of it, for sure. Erin.
How much is going on translating text into Chinese, and also how complicated would it be to add Chinese translators to that table?
That's an
local cost, or is it really a whole separate project?
No, it needs to be an integrated project. It's not a whole separate project, but it's a whole larger concentric circle to the project. Certainly the vision would be, our executive editor, Bob Thurman, who's also the president of Tibet House, who's the executive editor and president of American Institute of Buddhist Studies, has long had the vision and put out the vision of having, if we had the funding, if we could do it the right way, the way we'd love to do it, of having a round table where you'd actually bring together multiple scholars who were fluent in, hopefully you'd have a lingua franca like English, where everybody at least had something in common. If not, you'd have to have a UN-style multi-translation thing, but a round table in which you had a Russian translator, a Hindi translator, a German translator, Chinese translator, Japanese, etc., maybe 10 or 15 major world languages. You'd bring scholars together, you'd be working on a particular text that was important. The goal to be to hash out, maybe in English or maybe in some language that everybody could, maybe 1 or 2 languages, hash out the scholarly problems with the text, because sometimes it's not easy. It's not just like translating a verse of Shakespeare or a verse of something from a newspaper. Sometimes it's really tricky. But once you've sort of figured out the questions about what is going on here, what is he obliquely referencing, what is he specifically referencing, what's the underlying, once you sort of understand, in other words, what the text says, if multiple scholars with multiple languages had that conversation at the same time, they would be then empowered to then simultaneously translate at least that passage, maybe that chapter, into 15 different languages. They could then reconvene and do it for the next chapter. I mean, there are different ways to do it practically in terms of how you would actually pull it off. But the idea of sort of simultaneously doing this work would be ideal. The other way to do it, of course, is you let, the way it's proceeding now, it's kind of just by necessity, is if a team of scholars does all of this work and gets it out in English, then if subsequent to that a team of scholars wants to do it into Russian or Chinese, they can look at our work that we've done in English. We can work with them, give them the electronic text, give them the Tibetan text, the Sanskrit text, whatever resources we had, and they could very, very rapidly take that English translation with all the scholarly apparatus and turn it into a Chinese or a Russian translation. The trick there, it's a little bit easier said than done, though, of course, because to be a good translation, to be relevant to a Chinese audience, you might need to reference Chinese scholars and philosophers and traditions other than Nagarjuna and Derrida and Sigmund Freud. I mean, you might need to be referencing relevant Chinese traditions. So there's a certain amount of scholarly work that would still have to go on the Chinese side. And of course, the question of terminology is a very, very big problematic question. What we work, probably an enormous amount of our work is spent figuring out the right English term to translate a certain Tibetan and Sanskrit term. I didn't mention, I don't think it came up in my slides, but in terms of extant, we mentioned extant Sanskrit texts are about 2 million. If you look at the Tibetan Tengyur, though, of the 4,000 texts in the Tibetan Tengyur, about 5% of what's now in Tibetan is extant in Sanskrit. So most of the Sanskrit for the Tibetan texts have been lost. At the time this canon was compiled by Butun and others in the 1300s, all the Sanskrit existed for everything, because that was one of the criteria they used to compile these canons, was because you had thousands of texts floating around Tibet at this time. Everything had just been destroyed in India. Thousands of texts floating around Tibet claiming to be authentic Indian, Sanskrit translations, Tibetan translations of Tibetan sutras or shastras. And the scholars at the time had to come up with some criteria for separating the wheat from the chaff, or at least, how do you authenticate? So one criteria they used was, can we find a Sanskrit original manuscript that corresponds to this text in Tibetan that claims to be a translation of it? If you could find both, then it kind of went into one pile, and that went into the canon. In some cases, you'd find Tibetan texts that were just obvious forgeries or apocrypha. They kind of go into another category, although some practitioners would consider that that was a sacred text to them, and they didn't like that, but so they could continue to consider it sacred to them, but it wouldn't be part of the official canon. Then you had, you had these two. Then you had texts that seemed legitimate. They seemed, what the content was seemed like it definitely looked like it could be a Buddhist text, Shastra or Sutra, but we couldn't find a Sanskrit original anywhere, so that kind of went into a hybrid zone of probably legitimate, but we can't say. So at the time these canons were created, the Kangur and Tengyur, you had Sanskrit originals for all of these 6,000 texts, the 2 and the 4. But over the course of time, the Sanskrit manuscripts, disintegrated. They weren't copied. Many more were destroyed in the invasions of Tibet from 1950 to 59. It's possible that some Sanskrit texts are still hidden away somewhere in Tibet. It's possible we'll still find some more in clay pots somewhere. But as far as we know, there's only about 5% of extant Sanskrit. What that means is when you're translating one of these texts, one of these shastras, you still have to be fluent in Tibetan and Sanskrit, even if there's no Sanskrit original, because, as you know, anybody who's studied this kind of material, when you're looking at a Tibetan text that's a translation from a Sanskrit text, the way the grammar works and the kind of choice of words works is kind of different than indigenous native Tibetan. And you have to kind of triangulate and infer what the underlying Sanskrit would have been. You can do that on the basis of the vocabulary from other texts you've looked at and so forth. So you're still using both. And in the context of doing that, you're looking at the Sanskrit word, whether it exists or whether you're inferring it, and the Tibetan word, and what did both of those words mean? What were the connotations in those cultures and languages? And now you're trying to find what English word captures the widest range of that. Because if you just pick a word, and almost any word that's of any significance you could think of has these problems. Even a word like mind or consciousness or love or compassion or wisdom or any word you can think of has specific resonances. If you were to say unconscious, suddenly that has all sorts of, or subconscious, or that has sort of Freudian resonances. And what the Buddhists mean by sort of a subtle level of consciousness has nothing to do with what Freud meant by the unconscious. So you have to be very careful in all of these word choices and do your best. Include glossaries in your book, footnotes and prefatory matter to explain What do these key terms mean in the context of this translation? And the other problem is the exact same word in Sanskrit and Tibetan might mean something very different in a text on logic than in a text on meditation. Same exact word, which isn't different than in English. In English, sometimes the exact same word means something very different in different contexts. So, if we come up with these good English translations and they pass muster and enough people think they're great, when they're now going to be translated into Chinese or into Russian, they have to be thinking along similar lines. Well, what did this English word mean in that context, and what Russian word would mean the right thing in the Russian context or in the Chinese context? So it'll take a lot longer to get these 4,000 texts translated into all global languages. But it'll certainly be expedited if we can get all of it done in English in 30 years. And it would be expedited even more if we could have people working simultaneously as opposed to sequentially in Chinese, Russian, a few of the key European languages, key Indian languages, Hindi and so forth. So ideally we could be doing it collaboratively, if not simultaneously, if not then at least sequentially. But in your other questions, how much of this is currently going on in the Chinese? Very, very little. I mean, again, one of the universities we were corresponding with, for which I put together these charts about, well, if you want to know, this is the difference in the two canons. They didn't even know. The scholars there weren't even fully aware of the discrepancy of what they were essentially missing. So there's a great deal of interest. It's picking up in both mainland China and in Taiwan. It's certainly picking up, but it's quite a few phases behind in terms of the awareness and the efforts going on in West. But we're hoping that'll pick up. And likewise in India. I mean, India, hopefully, Indians will start to fully recognize and appreciate the incredible wealth of this heritage. It's been said that, what is India's greatest export? And you think in terms of technology, or you think, in terms of food. India's biggest export, arguably, is Buddhism. In terms of what has India given to the world, Buddhism is, I would argue, probably its largest export in terms of impact and volume. What it did throughout Asia was astonishing over quite a few centuries, and what it's now doing to the West and to the globe is astonishing. So, hopefully, enlightened Indians will themselves recognize the value of this and help to support translating these texts not only back into Sanskrit, which to some extent is happening at the Central University of Tibetan Studies. There's been an initiative for a few decades now to translate Tibetan texts back into Sanskrit, but then also, of course, translating them to modern Indian languages like Hindi and other languages, so that Indian culture can reappropriate its Buddhist heritage. It's a lot of work. Take a few lifetimes. Yes?
You know what? I'm going to ask you to use
Microphone.
this. I'm sorry.
Just curious that in this technological age, is machine translation useful at any point yet?
Excellent question. The answer is yes. In fact, large parts of our conferences we've participated in and hosted have had entire panel discussions on this. People that we're working with, Paul Hackett, who was not able to be here tonight, has worked extensively on this. Not only machine translation, but electronic resources in general. So, for example, I'll come to machine translation in a second, but even prior to that, the fact that we have, for example, the entire Tibetan Tengyur, which is on these block prints, there's 7 editions of it, these have all been scanned by the Tibetan Buddhist Resource Project in Boston, initially headed by Gene Smith before he passed away. They digitally scanned the entire Kongyur and Tengyur right off the bat, and hundreds of thousands of these indigenous Tibetan texts. So scholars don't have to go actually find a physical Kongyur Tengyur at Columbia University. You can get it on a CD-ROM. You can get it online. These are actual scans of the actual block prints of the Tibetan texts. Separately from that, another group that's been working for decades, the Asian Classics Input Project, has keyed in, ASCII typed in, the transliteration scheme that was developed a few decades ago for typing in Tibetan letters into Roman letters. So they've keyed in the whole Kongyur and Tengyur, and then many other texts. Again, when you get into the Tibetan literature, it's hundreds of thousands of texts. It'll take forever. But the core texts we're looking at, the Kongyur and Tengyur, have all been keyed in, which helps a lot for doing word searches and doing, an analysis of things in text and actually looking up quotes. It really speeds up the process of doing scholarly research. The problem with the ACIP texts is they're full of typos. They acknowledge it. even though they go through multiple checks and they have multiple people look at them, they still end up with lots of typos. So you can't rely on them 100%, but you can use them as something to help find things quickly. If you don't find something, it doesn't mean it's not there, because it might have been a typo. So the typed in resources help. The scanned text, which is what you really need to look at, help a lot. Then, of course, there's all sorts of online dictionaries that people have compiled. Multiple scholars have collaborated to put in, different translators' favorite choices and the Sanskrit roots of the Tibetan words and so forth. So there's a lot of digital resources at our disposal, which is one of the things that makes working on this project today so exciting and so possible to get it done in such a short period. In terms of machine translation specifically, we're not there yet. Tibetan is an extremely difficult language in terms, it's not related, I don't know if you know this, but Tibetan is not related to any other language on the planet. It's its own language group. The Tibeto-Burmese language group is its own language group. So there aren't even common roots of words, whereas Sanskrit, again, it's related to Latin and Greek. It's much easier to deal with, which is then related to English. Or English, has a lot of Latin roots to it. So a lot of Sanskrit words, you can see resonances even with English words sometimes, which helps in your translation choice sometimes. Tibetan's its own language. So in terms of machine translation, Paul Hackett and others have been working on this for quite a few years. He did a lot of machine translation in Washington, D.C., helping government agencies come up with software that could, come up with rough translations. What the CIA and others are interested in is, quick translations of either something oral, or, broadcast, or something written in a newspaper. And that, of course, we've had for some time in Russian and Uzbek and Afghan, other languages. You can take a paragraph from one of those languages, drop it in, and the machine translation parses it, figures out parses of pieces of speech, looks things up in a context-sensitive lexicon, and can spit out a rough translation. No way is it a translation you would publish, but it gives you a quick idea of at least the content of what's being talked about here. So likewise, with Tibetan translation, Paul and others have I think, finished the part of speech tagging, so you can take an ASCII text like from ACIP, dump it in there, and it can at least essentially diagram the sentence and figure out where the phrases start and stop and start to begin to tag things. It's about halfway done from what I understand. Again, funding is a big issue because he has full-time work to do elsewhere in our project in translating, but he has told us that if he was able to unplug from everything else and just work on this full-time, he could probably have it done in about a year. And what that would do would be, it would enable us to take the entire Tengir, the keyed-in ASCII of the entire Tengir, dump it into this, and spit out a rough translation. It's, again, easier said than done because you have these 17 genres. So not only is it parts of speech and so forth that have to be tagged, but they have to be tagged by genre because the same word means something totally different in a different context. So you have to have a very, very robust lexicon that is sensitive to different genres. It's actually tricky. It might take more than a year. It might take a couple of years. But yes, if we could get that completed, that would enable us to quickly get rough translations of texts, which would help scholars in their there's still, in my estimation, if I was doing the translation, I've done some of this translation work myself, it would probably help maybe 20%. So a 3-year project might become a 2.5-year project. It would jumpstart, in other words, it gives you something to start with quickly. It could also steer you wrong, though. That's another danger. You can think that you understood this piece, and only when you went back and looked at it carefully, realize you spent 2 months misunderstanding this because the machine translation steered you the wrong way. But yes, it could help speed things up a little bit.
Could you just clarify?
Two things about what you said. You said that it was a transliteration. How is that transliteration used? You said the one that had typos.
Yeah.
I didn't quite understand that. And also, in translating, once something is translated to English, to get it to Russian or another language, is the machine more helpful there? I wasn't thinking so much of the actual Tibetan.
Again, I don't know if it would be helpful. You'd have to leave it to the Russian scholars to determine if it would certainly be helpful probably, but I don't know. The kinds of translators you're going to have on the Russian end, if we use that as an example, would have to be so good at Russian and English, both, basically bilingual, and they'd have to be Buddhologists, so they know what's being talked about. This even comes down to something mundane as making an index. If we take one of our finished books and outsource the index to somebody, we get back an index that doesn't make sense, or that doesn't capture the right words in the right way, or doesn't organize them in the right way. So you actually have to be a Buddhologist even to index a work well. But a Russian translator would have to be, relatively bilingual in Russian and English, or at least have a team where you had a person who was fluent in Russian, that was their mother tongue, and pretty good in English, and vice versa. Somebody whose mother tongue was English, but they were pretty good at Russian. And they'd have to be Buddhologists, so they knew what this stuff was talking about and weren't just sort of making stuff up. And if they were that good, then it's questionable how much the machine translation from English to Russian would help them anyway. Because as I mentioned earlier, when we talk about 6 hours per folio side, that's to do a full translation. But if you're fluent in the two languages, you could bang something out quick in a few minutes. So would the machine translation help in that case? I don't know if it really would that much, or if the scholars would even want to be, again, thrown off down a wild goose chase by a bad machine translation. They'd probably just want to do it themselves. That would be my guess. But yes, it could, who knows? That would have to be decided on a case-by-case basis. Maybe in some cases scholars would want to use an already extant machine translation program that would go from English to Russian, for example, if that already exists. Maybe that would help. And as far as the transliteration goes, quickly speaking, Russian is, Tibetan just has an alphabet, 30 consonants, 4 vowels. It's a little bit funny because it's not just written linearly. They write linearly left to right, but occasionally they stack things up. So they can put SGRU, can all go, you can go B and then SGRU and then BS. You can type things sort of vertically and horizontally, but basically they came up with a scheme. Turrell Wiley came up with a scheme in 1959 for coming up with an equivalent of each of those for the 26-letter alphabet that we use. And that's what it is. So some Tibetan letters and also Sanskrit letters have to be represented by a diphthong in English. So DH, for example, would represent one letter in Tibetan.
So. There's a consensus about that.
Oh yeah, that's been a standard that's been in place for years. There has been some modifications. The ASIP people came up with some modifications for some various reasons, because there's certain Sanskrit clusters and mantras that weren't in the original Wiley system. So it's been modified and added to a little bit, but it's a standard system. Yeah.
So Tom,
yes.
Of the short list of, I thought it was 491.
491 texts, yes.
If I got it right. How many have in fact been translated into?
Also a good question. Some of them, certainly some of them have, not a large number, but so there's some of the greatest hits are in there. I don't have the top of my head a list.
A handful?
Yeah, probably 10. In terms of quantity, like folios, which is maybe the most useful thing to look at, probably 10% of that exists. So that does cut down the effort somewhat, although it doesn't always cut it down, because we would have to look at each one on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes you have 4 or 5 translations of Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamaka Karakas. We would need to assess if the translations that are out there are up to the standards of the series. We're trying to create a series of translations that meet certain standards. They're not all going to have the exact same translation terminology, because that would be impossible to impose upon that many different translators, but at least within a certain range. And if the extant translations that were out there are considered good, but sort of fall outside the range of what we would like to see as sort of a normative range, we would want to retranslate that. Wouldn't be a big effort because it's been done 6 times. Likewise with Shantideva's Bodhicharyavatara and so forth. In some cases, some of the texts have had 1 or 2 chapters translated, but not the whole text. But as a thumbnail guess, probably 10%, some of which we'd need to evaluate. And if it's done, we would not redo it. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. If it's been done well, and we could just consider it in our series, in our database, we'd say, okay, for this text, go see that translation.
Is it done in good faith that no 2 different teams are working on the same text?
Is it, so your question was?
How do we decide who does what text, or that 2 different groups aren't doing the same text?
Well, that's a good question too. Part of the problem today is that's exactly what goes on, is there's a lot of people duplicating each other's efforts that don't even know what sometimes they don't even know what they're doing. And they'll work 3 or 4 years, one person at the university, one person in a cave or somewhere, and they'll spend 4 or 5 years of their life doing this work and then find out, oh, we've both been doing the same thing. You would think in an ideal world that wouldn't happen. They would say, oh, I know you're doing it, great, I don't have to do it. In practice, what happens is scholars tend to have big egos and opinions of their own work, and even though I know you're doing it, it's like, well, but you come from this other lineage and I'm going to do a better job. And so unfortunately scholars tend to compete anyway, be they scholars in the academy or scholars. There's a large number of what are called unaffiliated scholars who may or may not have gotten a degree, but that are translating just on their own, or maybe with some support. So you have unaffiliated scholars and scholars who are affiliated with some sort of institution. Sometimes they don't know they're working on the same text. Sometimes they do know it and they don't care because they think they're going to do it their own way. Sometimes they're attached to a specific lineage, a particular Tibetan lineage, and they're not interested in translating. And this would be a problem from our perspective in terms of a text that had already been translated. If a text was translated extremely well, but from a very sectarian Kagyepa, without being clear about that. So they gave a particular, shentong or a particular spin on what this text said. We would consider that to be a great work. It's great that it was done, but it doesn't meet the kind of criteria we're looking for, which is a text that's translated openly enough and aware of the different possible ways you could interpret it, that it's upfront about that and gives you all those possible interpretations. So we would consider that sort of like a sectarian translation that would still need to be redone. So part of the idea behind having these international conferences like we've hosted and continuing to do this and to have our material up on the website and to start to work to collaborate with other translators is precisely to try to head this off of the past, to get people working together more collaboratively, to at least be aware of what each other's doing. Right now there are several databases, but they're not a one-stop shopping place where everybody goes to find out. But you can, if you wanted to start translating a text tomorrow, you could find out by searching several websites pretty quickly. You'd have an 80% chance of knowing for sure whether or not somebody else was maybe working on that text. And that may or may not stop you from wanting to work on it anyway. But as far as we're concerned, we would like to put together the infrastructure that allows people to work together instead of working against each other or duplicating work, and ideally to work with us in a collaborative manner with other scholars to produce these kinds of middle-of-the-road translations that'll reach a broader audience and sort of stand the test of time. That's our interest, is really to sort of be the organization that sometimes our own scholars do the translation, but more often than not just oversee and help work on an editorial level to help a given translator or team of translators pair up with the other right people over here and get something done that we could feel good about publishing. Okay, a couple more minutes. And we got to wrap up.
Yeah,
William.
I'm just wondering how the Tibetan texts of the Kanjur and Tenjur, how did they survive the immense destruction of the Chinese occupation?
Well, that's a good question. They survived because the Kanjur and Tenjur, very shortly after they were sort of compiled and became an official canon, it was within a century, it was very, very quickly after that, the block printing actually was developed in Tibet. So they would then actually, carve out backwards letters, these blocks that became essentially like a printing press. So many thousands of copies of the Kanjur and Tenjur were printed and housed in thousands of monasteries around Tibet. Over time, you had different editions of these, so that's why you end up with 7 different editions: the Derge, the Lhasa, the Chone, the Nartang, different Tibetan editions. And all of them exist, because there were basically, in short, there were so many of them, it would have been impossible. You'd have to completely have destroyed Tibet.
So they were dispersed.
They were dispersed everywhere, and they actually made it out, of Tibet long before '59, because this was known to be an important canon. Those texts in particular had made it out to India and elsewhere long before 1959. What was the biggest loss in Tibet were the indigenous Tibetan texts, of which there were hundreds of thousands, if not millions. And those were, those were oftentimes, if it was a well-known scholar, important scholar in a Tibetan monastery, they would make block prints. Maybe some 17th century Kagyu master, a Nyingma master, everybody acknowledged this was a really important text. They'd make a block print of it and print a whole bunch of them. And more often than not, those survive, but not always, because they might be just in a particular monastery or valley. If that monastery's library was destroyed, then those texts were gone forever. Or if they're manuscripts, again. So, and to this day, so a lot of them made it out, a lot of them didn't. To this day, texts are still smuggled out, or still being smuggled out of Tibet. One of the big projects that Gene Smith started in 1960, right after the Tibetan diaspora, was a project with the Library of Congress to knowing that this was going to be such an important treasure to preserve. Tibetan refugees who fled in 1959-60, actually one of the things they would bring with them, they had the shirt on their back and they make these life-threatening escapes over the Himalayas, and oftentimes the one thing they bring with them would be a book or a sack of books. That's how much they value this material. So Gene Smith and others at the Library of Congress recognized this and actually developed what we call a food for thought program. It was literally a food for thought program. What they did is they came up with an arrangement between the Library of Congress and the Indian government where certain areas in India needed food, and the Library of Congress decided in its wisdom that we were interested in this knowledge, in these texts. So if a Tibetan refugee came out with some texts and the Indian government could procure those texts and give them to the Library of Congress, then the U.S. would in turn give them rice and food and so forth, which is what happened and continued for many decades. A program like that continues to this day. So tens of thousands of texts were actually brought over to the U.S., photographed, microfilmed at the time. They didn't have scanning. Nowadays they scan them and put into libraries, various libraries around the country. So what's called the PL 480 collection. So that's an enormous number of Tibetan texts, indigenous Tibetan texts that have been preserved through that program. But again, percentage-wise, I wouldn't even want to hazard a guess, but it's a very small percentage of the Tibetan texts that could be preserved. The vast majority are still in Tibet or they were destroyed. So I don't know what those numbers would be. But yeah, the Kangri and Tangri, we have no problem. Those are everywhere, fortunately. Yeah. So I think we're out of time, but thank you so much for coming out.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
This video was brought to you in part through the generous support of Tibet House US membership community and viewers like you. To learn more about the benefits of Tibet House membership, please visit tibethouse.us. Thanks for watching. Tashi Delek.